But anyway, so look, it's a disgrace what's going on. In the meantime, we're doing a great job running the country. And that's what I'm focused on, running the country. It's a very unfair situation.
Look at the double standard, though. You got Hillary in the dossier. You got Ukraine interfering on her behalf. Then you got Schiff, who's been telling us for 3 years.
Lies.
Then he's connected to the whistleblower, so he can't bring the whistleblower in. Then you got
they met with the whistleblower. Nobody knew that. We just found out. They knew. And where is the person that gave the whistleblower the information? Because is that person a spy? Or does that person even exist? I have a feeling that person doesn't exist. I think Schiff might have made it up.
Apparently Schiff knows him, and so does Joe Biden.
Well, now the funny thing is that they say that the whistleblower, they don't need the whistleblower anymore. Why don't they need the whistleblower? You know why they don't need the whistleblower? Because the whistleblower's account of my conversation was totally wrong. Now, they had no idea I was going to release the conversation. And normally I wouldn't. I mean, I'm talking to a foreign leader. I don't want to release a conversation. People aren't going to want to talk to me or any other president. But that's what happened, and it's a disgrace.
So, but I want to go to the double standard again. Whether it's the dossier, whether it's Ukraine helping and interfering on our elections, whether there is no quid pro quo, then you can add Hunter Biden and Joe Biden on tape bragging about using taxpayer dollars to demand the firing of a Ukrainian prosecutor. Hunter Biden admits no experience Ukraine, China, no experience in oil, gas, energy, or private equity.
Thrown out
millions
of the Navy.
of dollars.
Thrown out of the Navy.
Yeah.
Okay. Hunter Biden was thrown out of the Navy.
Why was he given that money? Would anyone else get that money?
It's a payoff, in my opinion. It's a payoff. Why else would it be? Look, Hunter Biden with no experience. Now, I hear the number's $168,000 a month, and I heard they got a $3 million payment.
Split between him and another guy.
They get a $3 million payment and all of this, okay? And that's corruption. That's something has to be investigated. That's what you have to look. But I watched this crazy Anderson Cooper the other day during the debate. Apologize for having to ask the question to them. Apologize. If that were me...
He declared his innocence.
If that were my sons that took $168,000 from this very questionable company, an energy company, and they knew nothing about energy at all. He knew nothing about energy, and he has a bad record, bad track record, including getting thrown out of the Navy. And even the way he got in the Navy is interesting in his position. If that were Don Jr., if that were Eric Trump, who are very outstanding young men, it would be the biggest story of the century.
And what does it say about the media? I agree with you.
The media is corrupt. Not all media is. Look, I know some great people, including you, but I know some great journalists. Look, they gave Pulitzer Prizes to people that got it wrong. Okay? All these people from the New York Times, which is a fake newspaper. We don't even want it in the White House anymore. We're going to probably terminate that in the Washington Post. They're fake. But you take a look at the New York Times, and you take a look at the kind of reporting they do, it turned out to be all wrong. And after the election, the New York Times apologized for their coverage because they were covering me in such a way. So when I won, they actually apologized to their subscribers because they were losing thousands and thousands of subscribers. The New York Times wrote an apology, nothing else. You know, they're saying, well, it wasn't really an apology. It was, because they covered me so badly. And then what I said, sort of interesting, I hope, I said, you know, the good news is now I'll be covered fairly again. And you know what happened? I got covered worse. I got covered worse. But that's okay. You know who was covered worse than me, they say?
Who?
Abraham Lincoln. I've heard the one person, it used to be 5 or 6, now it's down to 1, Honest Abe Lincoln. They say he got the worst press of anybody. I say I dispute it.
Let me ask you, so have the Democrats already jumped out of the plane, can't go back? Do you see a scenario where they will impeach you, there'll be a trial in the Senate, and then the people get to speak? Would that be the ultimate revenge, which is your re-election if the people speak?
So everybody tells me it's going to be great for us as a Republican Party if they actually impeach me, because the 40 seats, and there were many more than the 32, it's 40, 45 seats, where I won or did really well or very close, that those people are going to get hammered, meaning running in Congress. So I don't know if that's true or not. I do say this, and I can see it because I've been, I mean, look at our fundraising.
Trump 2020! Yeah! Resign! Why aren't you worried about our kids being slaughtered
With the
here?
2020
Okay? My child was beaten to death, and you were given an extended invitation to come march at our child abuse march annually, and you haven't showed up to not one.
I'm sorry.
But you care so much about
I'm
children,
sorry,
right?
I didn't hear
Yeah,
what you
whatever. You're a fake, and you should be
Super immature. You're an
impeached
adult. You should be
yourself.
ashamed of
You
yourself.
be quiet. You don't even know anything. You're
Stop.
nothing but a
No,
damn
stop,
kid.
stop. I'm 20!
Trump 2020. Trump 2020. That's right. That's right. We don't like
Look at the hate he's got!
I like your guns.
In light of the political attention surrounding the borderland and border security along the U.S.-Mexico border, 2 local congresswomen led a congressional delegation along the border today. KTS 79 News reporter Stephanie Shields gives us the report from Sunland Park.
Congresswoman Veronica Escobar and Xochitl Torres Small hosted a border tour on Saturday to help teach other Democrats from Congress what it's like living on the border and its security.
It's frustrating to know that we are being painted as a dangerous place meant to be controlled.
Representatives saying in order to come together with a bipartisan solution for border security, people need to see the border and the surrounding communities for themselves.
We also know that we need an agency that will continuously adapt to changing threats and circumstances. And that's why you have to look at the border on a mile-by-mile basis.
Congressional delegates toured different ports of entries, spoke with immigration advocates, and were briefed by CBP on border security.
One of the things they said that unfortunately our president has not made clear enough is that it is a mix of policies that will make our communities safe, our border secure.
For those reps who had never been to the southern border, it was a way to gain knowledge of it, to better explain to their constituents.
With all the debate about what we're doing about border security, it was important to me to come here and see how very different it is from the northern border where I grew up.
Saying CBP agents showed them what the borders need for better security, more detection technology, agents, and more immigration judges.
I want America to take a step back and realize that political rhetoric is political rhetoric, but the truth and the facts are also here, and that's what we should be conveying to the American people.
And this tour comes just days after President Trump said El Paso was once one of the most dangerous cities before the border fence, and just 2 days before he makes his visit to the borderland on Monday. Reporting in Sunland Park, Stephanie Shields, KTSM 9 News.
I like people always to be able to tell whatever their story it is. So what is your mission, given the fact that you're telling me the things that you're telling me? You know, there's drug cartels, there's drugs, there's people being dropped off. What is the mission of your organization?
Open Carry Texas has as its mission, and that would be CJ up ahead with the body armor. He's the founder of Open Carry Texas.
The white shirt.
Yeah.
The white shirt with the body armor. His mission is to promote the lawful and legal carry of weapons, because as a nation, when we disarm our population, we're only creating the environment for a dictatorship to flourish. If you look at countries who have Mexico has no law where you can carry any kind of weapon. It's against the law to carry in Mexico. If you go from here to there, a Marine carrying anything would be jailed, imprisoned in Mexico for carrying a weapon from American side to the Mexican side, even though there are military. We want to promote, Open Carry Texas promotes the legal and lawful carrying of weapons and the proper training of its citizens to be able to protect ourselves. When you're at home, you should be able to protect your home. You should be able to protect your family. Our Second Amendment guarantees that right to us. Concerned citizens of El Paso, which is the group that I represent, when we created the human border wall in February, when we stood that line for 45 minutes for our 45th president, it was to bring attention to an area where a lot of human trafficking occurs. When people don't want to come through our legal port of entry, we have to ask ourselves why. We are the most generous nation in the world. We allow over 1 million legal migrants, immigrants, to come into our country legally. When you're trying to come in through our back door, it can't be for a good reason. We have to ask why. It's not that we are being racist. It's not that we don't want people in our country. We want you to come through the right way. We want to make sure that your intentions for our country are just as viable and righteous as our own for wanting to live in a free nation. If we are not careful with our free nation, we're only one generation from losing it. And today we have our schools that don't even teach our Constitution. I remember when I went to school, by 3rd grade, I knew the Constitution of the United States of America. I could recite to you the preamble by the beginning of 3rd grade. It was a requirement. They don't even know the Constitution when they graduate high school at this point. They don't know our history. And as long as we continue to take away our statues, to take away the things that made our nation great, good, bad, indifferent, all of it made us what we are today. Our good history and our bad history is what made America great. We can't say that we were prosperous and wonderful the whole time, because we weren't. It would be a lie. Nothing good happens without being forged through the fire of pain. So does that make slavery right? No, it doesn't. But does it mean we should eliminate that history? No, we should not. Because if we forget our past, we're destined to repeat it.
Sherman resumes his advance on Atlanta, this time from the west, trying to cut the Macon Railroad, the city's only remaining supply route. On July 28th, one of Hood's subordinates launches a frontal attack near Ezra Church. It is a disaster. The Confederates lose 3,000 men to the Union's 700. But Hood has succeeded in keeping the railroad to Atlanta open. Sherman knows that the 12-mile ring of fortifications surrounding Atlanta is too strong to penetrate. Frustrated, he tries another tactic, unleashing a barrage of fire that no other American city has ever endured. The bombardment will last for 5 weeks.
Sherman wanted to do a number on Atlanta, and we wanted to destroy Atlanta and make it a desolation. He would tell his artillery commanders, fire 50 rounds, all guns that can reach downtown. Fire all the guns that can strike the buildings of Atlanta.
For the roughly 3,000 civilians remaining in Atlanta, it is horrifying. One of the first casualties is a freed African American who runs a barber shop in the Atlanta hotel, Solomon Lucky.
A shell strikes the iron lamppost. Part of it hits him in the leg. He dies by nightfall of loss of blood, shock, or hemorrhage. Don't know. Today, the iron lamppost stands where it was, now an underground at what was then Alabama and Whitehall.
Sherman orders his men to fire from every gun you have that will reach any of its houses. Sam Richards writes,
"A gentleman and his little girl, 10 years of age, were both killed by the same shell last week." Sam Richards.
It is one of the most tragic stories of the entire bombardment. The story of Joseph Warner and his 10-year-old daughter, Lizzie.
They have their house in northwest Atlanta, and they're sleeping on the night of August 3rd when a shell comes through and kills her, disembowels him. He's dead within an hour or so. They're buried in Oakland Cemetery, in the city cemetery. And it just shows that, you know, this war, this bombardment can be reduced to very pathetic individual terms.
In her diary, another 10-year-old girl, Carrie Berry, records her feelings.
How I wish the Federals would quit shelling us and we could get out of the cellar and get some fresh air. The shells get worse and worse every day.
We're not sure how many Atlantans were still in the city by this point, but probably a couple thousand. And they took refuge in holes that they dug in their cellars or their gardens.
A lot of Atlantans, the wealthy ones, especially who had spacious backyards, had their slaves dig what we'd call bomb-proof shelters. And some of these bomb-proofs were large enough to accommodate a couple of dozen people.
But in August of 1864, the enslaved population is shrinking.
A growing number of slaves were running away in groups, and some of them were running to Union lines.
Carrie Berry writes about the family's enslaved house servant, Mary.
Mary went off this evening, and I don't expect she will come back anymore.
It was no secret to the slaves when there had been Confederate setbacks and when the Union Army was advancing. So they were, I think, pretty well poised by this time to seize every opportunity to take their own freedom into their hands.
By late August, an estimated 30,000 shells have pummeled Atlanta. Under such dire circumstances, no one has time to keep accurate records. It's estimated that at least 50 civilians were killed or wounded. But Sherman is no closer to victory. His bombardment has done nothing to weaken Hood's Confederate army. Meanwhile, in Chicago, the Democrats nominate former General George McClellan on a platform calling for a negotiated peace with the Confederacy. The stalemate at Atlanta is seen as proof the war cannot be won. Lincoln's re-election and the prospects for union and emancipation are very much in doubt. Lincoln remarks, "I'm going to be beaten, and unless some change takes place, badly beaten." But back in Atlanta on August 26th, war-weary residents awake to a strange sound. Silence. The shelling has stopped.
The Confederate defenders assume that maybe Sherman has given up and he is retreating north because he doesn't seem to be anywhere around.
It was wishful thinking on the Confederates' part. Instead, Sherman, frustrated with the stalemate in Atlanta, has taken most of his army on a wide flanking march sweeping to the west and south of the city. Confederate counterattacks to hold the railroad fail.
He hits the railroad above Jonesboro, cuts the last railroad supply line into Atlanta, and essentially at that point, the jig is up for Hood, and by extension, the jig is up for Atlanta, and that's effectively going to be Union victory in the Civil War.
With all of Atlanta's supply lines now destroyed, General Hood knows it is over. If his army stays in the city, it will be starved to death. He orders an immediate evacuation. On the night of September 1st, a huge explosion rocks Atlanta.
The Confederates have an ammunition train that's stranded in Atlanta, and rather than let it fall into the hands of the Yankees, they have to blow it up. And it's such a huge explosion that it shatters windows and rattles windows all over Atlanta. It's this huge explosion. And 15 miles away down in Jonesboro, Sherman hears this, and he knows what it means. He knows that Hood is evacuating Atlanta.
On that September evening, as Hood's men march out of Atlanta, many of them sing the sad ballad Lorena as they depart.
It matters little now, Lorena.
On September 2nd, with Confederate troops gone, Mayor James Calhoun and a group of leading citizens ride out the Marietta Road to meet Sherman's advance guard. There, Calhoun formally surrenders the city. That night, Sherman telegraphs Lincoln, "And so Atlanta is ours and fairly won." The news electrifies the North. Lincoln's political fortunes soar with renewed hope for his re-election. It is one of the greatest turning points in American history. 10-year-old Carrie Berry writes of the soldiers in blue uniforms.
They are orderly and behave themselves. I think I shall like the Yankees very well.
But within a week, Sherman issues Special Field Order 67, expelling all remaining civilians from the city. Mayor Calhoun pleads with Sherman to reverse the order, saying it would cause overwhelming hardship. Sherman responds, "War is cruelty, and you cannot refine it."
The reason that Sherman wanted all the civilians out of town is because he didn't want to have to babysit a bunch of Southern sympathizers and possibly Southern saboteurs. And worse still, he didn't want to have to feed them with the rations that he needed for his army.
Among those forced to leave are the so-called secret Yankees, Northern sympathizers who kept their sentiments to themselves during the war. They are successful businessmen like Alfred Austell, a banker, William Markham, who ran the iron rolling mill, and Edward Rawson, a Vermont native whose huge mansion called the Terraces was taken over by Union General John White Geary.
All those secret Yankees who had hoped to be able to stay in the city and protect their property, no, he kicks them out too. They're mortified, but they have to go.
A few Atlantans are allowed to stay.
We commenced packing up to move. Papa heard uptown there was a chance for us to stay if he could get into business.
Carrie Berry's family is one of the few allowed to remain after her father, Madison, got a job as a clerk for the Union Army. For the nearly 3,000 white Atlantans forced to leave, it is an awful time. Roughly half are shipped south, others are sent north.
They can take some of their belongings, but not all of them, and of course they have to leave their residences behind. And maybe 1,600 Atlantans will be dumped into rebel lines, and the Confederates have to put them on the train and carry them into Macon.
But for Atlanta's African American population, it is a time of celebration.
They were celebrating freedom because of the arrival of the Yankees in Atlanta meant the end of slavery in Atlanta. And so for several days, African Americans filled the streets to celebrate this long-awaited, long-rumored arrival of the Yankees.
One unpleasant feature of present circumstances is the impudent air Negroes put on, and their indifference to the needs of their former masters. Sam Richards.
One of Atlanta's finest houses, the Neal Residence, now becomes Sherman's stately headquarters. This photograph, and around 200 others, are taken by George Barnard, hired by the Union Army to make a visual record of Atlanta and its fortifications. Barnard's photographs are the only ones made of wartime Atlanta.
The hot summer continued into the fall, and so it must have been sort of surreal because the city was just covered in dead animals, shell casings. It must have been a kind of spooky place, with most of the civilian population having been expelled in September.
Meanwhile, General John Bell Hood moves into North Georgia, trying to trap Sherman in Atlanta by cutting his only supply line to the north, the Western and Atlantic Railroad. Sherman sends some of his army north to chase Hood away from the railroad, but they can't reach Dalton in time. Here, 40,000 Confederate soldiers surround a Union garrison of only 850 men, guarding the railroad. Most are escaped slaves, like Hubbard Pryor of Polk County, Georgia. For more than a year, African Americans have fought in the segregated U.S. colored troops. This regiment is guarding the railroad behind the lines. Sherman refuses to have black regiments on the front lines.
Sherman was quoted once as saying that he believed that slavery was good for black people. So we know that he was no liberal.
Hubbard Pryor and his fellow soldiers in the 44th U.S. Colored Troops find themselves on the front lines anyway. Despite the impossible odds, they want to fight. Their white officers, however, believe their men will be massacred and choose to surrender.
Some of the men of the 44th were actually sent back to their former owners and re-enslaved. And those turned out to be the lucky ones. Most of them were put to work building Confederate fortifications, and they were almost worked to death. And it is just one of the saddest stories of the war. Here these guys had enlisted with such high hopes, and they suffered so much afterwards.
In Atlanta, the occupation and the destruction continues. Sherman's engineers dismantle hundreds of now vacant houses, using their timbers to build a new line of fortifications for his army. An army which in early November cast ballots in the presidential election. Sherman's soldiers vote overwhelmingly for Lincoln, who wins in a near landslide. Despite the renewed Northern resolve to win the war, Confederate resistance continues. Abandoning his effort to trap Sherman in Atlanta, Hood moves his army west into Alabama, preparing to invade Middle Tennessee. But Sherman realizes he can't stay in Atlanta, at the end of a long and vulnerable railroad supply line that the Confederates could eventually destroy. Instead, he has to abandon his supply line and take the offensive. Now Sherman comes up with a new plan to crush Confederate resistance, once and for all.
So what does Sherman do? He divides his army. He sends part of his army up into North Georgia and Tennessee to deal with Hood, and he sends the rest of the army to Savannah, where it can be resupplied by sea, and then march north to Virginia to finish off Lee.
By this, I propose to demonstrate the vulnerability of the South and make its inhabitants feel that war and individual ruin are synonymous. I will push into the heart of Georgia, destroying all. I can make the march and make Georgia howl. William T. Sherman.
He determines that he has to leave behind him a wasteland, in that he has to destroy anything that can be used by the Confederate Army to continue to wage war, to resist the United States. So that's why in Atlanta you're going to see the destruction of the mills, the factories, the railroad, anything that can be used.
On November 11th, Sherman's engineers begin carrying out a careful block-by-block demolition plan. They knock down public buildings with battering rams, including the gasworks and factories. Fearing that fire might get out of control, Sherman instructs his men not to burn any buildings until the last minute. He also places the churches and houses of downtown Atlanta under guard to prevent arson. At the same time, sick or injured soldiers are loaded onto the last trains headed north. Hundreds of African Americans hitch a ride. Once the last trains have left, Sherman's men tear up 40 miles of the Western and Atlantic Railroad above Atlanta, cutting their last link to the north. On the afternoon of November 15th, as Sherman's men file through the outskirts of Atlanta, they decide to wreak their own vengeance. Here, none of the houses are under guard. A Union officer from Ohio writes in his diary,
"We arrived in the suburbs of Atlanta at 2 p.m. No sooner did we arrive than the boys commenced burning every house in that part of town. The wind was blowing hard, and soon that part of the city was gone. Captain James Ladd."
General Slocum, who commanded the 20th Corps occupying the city, offered a $500 reward for any soldier who would turn in a comrade as an unintended arsonist. No one turned their comrades in.
During the night, engineers set fire to the rubble of the train depot, and to the commercial buildings in the downtown business district. True to Sherman's orders, they spare churches and homes in the area. Meanwhile, the band of the 33rd Massachusetts Regiment gives its last concert in Atlanta. When the engineers arrive to burn the concert hall where they are performing, the band moves down the street to serenade General Sherman at his headquarters. A Union major writes,
"Tonight I heard the really fine band of the 33rd Massachusetts playing John Brown's Soul Goes Marching On by the light of the burning buildings. I have never heard that noble anthem when it was so grand, so solemn, so inspiring." Major Ward Nichols.
On the morning of November 16th, Sherman's army marches out of Atlanta as clouds of dense black smoke rise behind them.
There were officers in Atlanta who had breakfast in the home that they had occupied, an empty mansion. And when they were finished, they stacked everything in the middle of the floor of the mansion and burned the mansion. There was no military value in that. There was no purpose to do that.
In all, about 40% of Atlanta is destroyed. But Sherman is not finished. Having cut his own supply lines, Sherman sets off on a 250-mile march to Savannah, straight through Confederate territory. His men will carry only the bare essentials, gathering food and forage along the way.
What Sherman was contemplating doing had never really been done before. I mean, Sherman was cutting loose of his supply lines and going to live largely, not entirely, but largely off the land.
He claimed in his memoir to have a census map of the state so that he knew for every county in Georgia how many bushels of corn, how many hundreds of cattle, hogs, etc. were in the state, so that he could plan his route through essentially the breadbasket of Georgia.
What Sherman's men can't eat, they destroy. Sherman cuts a 50-mile wide swath through central Georgia. The Confederacy is powerless to stop him. Sherman is making good on his promise to make Georgia howl.
We have devoured the land, and our animals eat up the wheat and cornfields close. All the people retire before us, and desolation is behind. To realize what war is, one should follow our tracks. William T. Sherman.
Sherman's march is not just a war on Southern resources. It's also a war on white Southern morale.
So it's really the psychological impact. It's the terror. Sherman's waging war against the minds of his opponents. He may not even haven't gotten to a town, but someone's afraid he's coming to my town and what he might do. And those women begin to write letters to their husbands in the army. And they say, "You must come home. This is ridiculous. We cannot continue the struggle."
On November 23rd, Sherman's men enter Milledgeville, the capital of Georgia. In the abandoned State House, they hold a mock legislative session in which they repeal the Ordinance of Secession.
When the Federals move into Milledgeville, they have a lot of fun. They find a whole lot of Confederate currency. So they end up stuffing money in their pockets so that they can, as they said, spend it when they go deeper into the South.
With them go thousands of slaves. By the time they are near Savannah, thousands of refugee slaves are following Sherman's army, seeking freedom and offering information on Confederate movements. Sherman is afraid they will clog the roads and slow down his army. 20 miles outside of Savannah, at Ebenezer Creek, one of Sherman's commanders orders a temporary bridge dismantled after the army crosses, but before any refugees can follow. Soon to their horror, some Confederate cavalry who have been shadowing Sherman's movements come upon them. Many are clubbed or stabbed. Some swim across, others drown.
Sights of elderly men hobbling across as best they could, women with babies in arms trying to cross. It was one of those, it was a terrible tragedy.
After brushing aside a small force of Confederate defenders, Sherman's men enter Savannah, It is December 21st, 1864. A triumphant Sherman telegrams President Abraham Lincoln.
I beg to present to you as a Christmas gift the city of Savannah with 150 guns and plenty of ammunition. Also about 25,000 bales of cotton. William T. Sherman.
In 37 weeks, Sherman's armies have marched more than 300 miles across Georgia. Atlanta, industrial hub of the Deep South, is in ruins. Bridges, cotton, livestock, factories, telegraph lines, and hundreds of miles of railroads are destroyed. In Savannah, Sherman makes the Charles Green Mansion his headquarters. And it is here that Sherman calls an unusual meeting of African American leaders, motivated perhaps by the tragedy at Ebenezer Creek. But his real objective was to solve a military problem.
What to do with these thousands of former slaves who were following his military soldiers at camp.
It's probably the first time in American history in which a white man asked a black man for advice. What do you think we ought to do?
The African American leaders tell Sherman that owning their own land is the only way to assure their freedom. But Sherman is far less concerned about freedom than he is about winning the war. 4 days after the meeting, Sherman issues Field Order 15, what came to be known as the 40 acres and a mule plan.
The idea was to take 400,000 acres of these coastal rice and cotton plantations, divide it up into 40-acre parcels, and then distribute those parcels to the formerly enslaved people.
It didn't last long. Believing the land redistribution plan was too radical, the new President Andrew Johnson revokes Field Order 15 within a year.
So the land that the freedmen had been working, that they had every expectation was going to be theirs in a few years, is suddenly taken away from them.
Sherman's main objective was always to restore the Union, not to free 4 million enslaved Americans. In the end, Sherman's march through Georgia accomplished both.
I think that's where that ambivalence comes from. There's some who recognize that Sherman was just, in fact, doing his job, and that part of that job meant that they would benefit in some way, but not that he was necessarily personally invested or interested in what that outcome would be for them.
It was the most decisive 37 weeks in American history, forever changing who we are as a nation and redefining freedom. And the one figure who affected that outcome more than any other is also its most controversial, William Tecumseh Sherman. By the 1870s, he is the commanding general of the U.S. Army and one of the most popular figures in America.
During Reconstruction, immediately after the war, a lot of white Southerners actually saw Sherman as a pretty good guy. He's a Democrat. He's clearly a white supremacist. He thinks that Republican efforts to impose civil rights on the South is going too far. And they say, well, as for what he did during the war, well, he was just doing what he had to do.
In 1879, and again in 1881, thousands turned out to welcome the aging general back to Atlanta. Newspapers jokingly thanked Sherman for tearing down the old city to make way for a new one. And aging Sam Richards writes sarcastically,
General Sherman has just honored our city by a visit to see how nicely we've built it up after he burned it.
Richards was one of hundreds of businessmen who invested in rebuilding the city. Today, S.P. Richards Company is Atlanta's oldest business in continual operation. After the war, Sherman also befriended his old foes, Joseph E. Johnston and John Bell Hood. The ex-Confederate generals are fighting a war of words in their memoirs, blaming each other for losing Atlanta and the war. Both wanted Sherman to back up their stories. Sherman tried to help them both, but the controversy over who lost Atlanta continues to this day. In 1891, at the age of 71, William T. Sherman died at his home in New York City. 84-year-old Joseph E. Johnston is one of the pallbearers. It is a cold and rainy day. In a show of respect, Johnston refuses to wear a hat. He dies of pneumonia a month later. Towards the end of the 19th century, the white Southern view of Sherman is changing. Sherman becomes the most hated man in the South, his name synonymous with the brutality of war. And yet, he also becomes one of the most respected of military leaders.
Patton agreed with Sherman. This whole idea that any attempt to make war easy, to make it soft, is going to lead to disaster because it's just going to drag it out and make it longer and bloodier in the end. The idea is that to make it fast, as brutal, as violent as possible, get it over with. And Sherman ends up being a hero for so many American generals in the 20th century.
Still, the scorched earth of Georgia is a lasting memory. Today, the Atlanta of 1864 has disappeared, but thanks to the photographs of George Barnard, we know what once was. His panoramic view, taken from the top of the Female Institute, later destroyed by Sherman's engineers. Here is the view today from the same spot, a balcony of the Sheraton Hotel at Cortlandt and Ellis Streets. Decatur Street then, and today, where Georgia State students bustle about. And this view of a slave auction house on Peachtree Street. Today, home to the 5 Points Martyr Station. The Battle of Atlanta in East Atlanta at Bald Hill. A hill that was cut through to make room for Interstate 20 at Moreland Avenue. Sherman's headquarters at what was once Atlanta's finest home, the Neal Residence. Today, Atlanta City Hall. Just a few blocks away, on Fairley Street, the home of Carrie Berry and family. Carrie, the little girl whose diary told us so much about that time, never fully escaped the horrors of war. Her son served in World War I and was the victim of a gas attack and committed suicide after the war. He is buried in Atlanta's Oakland Cemetery, next to his mother.